I have the pleasure of speaking to Professor James Blignaut and Dr. Hendrik Smith this morning from Asset Research. The discussion is mostly in how do we change over from conventional agriculture into regenerative agriculture. James, Hendrik, thank you very much for joining me, and thank you very much for the opportunity to actually have this discussion. James, I'm going to start with you. And we met in Rates, I think, in 2017 at the Landbouweekblad Regenerative or Herlewings Landbou conference, where you actually gave a talk on restoration. Can you elaborate a bit on that, please?
Yeah, thank you, Gerry. Hendrik is actually to blame because he organized that conference that we've met. Yeah, you know, Gerry, for most of my career, I worked in the field of the economics of restoration, and that is basically the costs and the benefits of fixing degraded landscapes. And when we talk about degraded landscapes, we actually talk about productive landscapes. So that's where humans interact with nature in one way or another, and then transform nature from one state to another. And then during that process of transformation, we lose ecosystem services. So we lose the capability of the land to absorb water, to provide food, to provide minerals, to provide pollination for animals and for fauna and flora. So we lose services, that which nature naturally gives us for free. And therefore we have to embark on a process of restoration, whereby we actually can address that and reverse the degradation to bring back the ecosystem goods and services. But that costs money. And so the economics of restoration then is, what does it cost to fix degraded landscapes in order for those degraded landscapes to become productive again and hopefully sustainable going forward? And in that sort of journey of mine, we've worked a lot in mining environments, conservation environments, and eventually also then in agricultural landscapes. And within that context, to convert from conventional deep tillage methods, monocropping, to regenerative or then conservation agriculture, that's a practical way of actually going from a method of operation, a method of managing land that is losing the topsoil, leaking out nutrients out of the system, carbon out of the system, to one that is actually healing the land. And so it's very easy then in that sense to determine what would the costs be and what would the benefits be. The one thing that is not so easy is the temporal effects, because in both contexts, the time cost as well as the benefit, time does matter a great deal. Because to make this conversion from, say, a conventional deep tillage system, monocropping system, a system which overgrazes the landscape, etc., to one that heals the land, regenerates the land, takes time. And because you do not switch and you do not mitigate and address the consequences of degradation that has happened over decades and even longer in one season. I mean, you have to realize that when you start this journey of regeneration or of healing the land or restoring the land, that you're in for the long haul. And so the big challenge there then is to say, how do we actually account then for this temporal effects? And very often that is then the barrier that makes it difficult for farmers and people that operate in the productive landscapes to do the conversion. Because logically it makes sense, but it is a temporal or then time-based barrier that you have to overcome. And the benefits, so the costs are very easy to calculate. What does it cost to convert from one production system to another production system? Implements, cattle, external inputs that has to change. But then in terms of the benefits, that often happen in the future. And you have to be able to think in terms of a future benefit stream, and that you have to make changes today in order to be able to reap those benefits going forward.
I think one critical part of this discussion is actually the debt that agriculture finds itself in as well. And Hendrik, I know you speak about it quite a bit as well. And if you could actually just elaborate a bit on that.
Yes, Gerry, I think that's where everything starts, and James can perhaps later elaborate on the economic cost and problems that farmers face due to the wrong practices. And it actually all starts with a degradation of the environment, which eventually spills over to the degradation of their financial situation, and they become severely challenged with the financial problems they faced, starting from the environmental problems due to mostly the conventional tillage-based practices. And farmers are the ones that become aware of the problems, but because they're partly responsible for these problems due to the wrong practices. And then they start to observe the problems of erosion, for example, soil loss due to water and wind erosion, biodiversity loss, and then eventually they feel the pressure on their pockets and their finances, and they really start to think, what can I do? I need to do something just to stay on the farm, just to support my family and the livelihoods in my environment or in my society. I need to do something. And then they start to look for options, solutions. And they start to find them somewhere, maybe in nature or in other places, and they start to experiment. They test it and see how it works and how they can adapt it in their situation, their context. And nowadays we call these ideas the principles of conservation or regenerative agriculture. Those are the principles they've identified over a number of decades to solve these problems. And if you want, I can quickly share those principles.
Yeah, go for it. I mean, you don't have to do it quickly.
Yeah.
You've got
right.
You've got time. So.
Okay, right. So, well, it is interesting. Well, maybe just stay where we are right at the beginning, where it all started. And the story is that conservation agriculture actually started in a Dust Bowl era of United States, where farmers really became under pressure due to environmental degradation and eventually financial cost pressures. And they started with this process of finding solutions and building it into their farming systems. And then that's where they started perhaps the first time to identify and test these principles of conservation agriculture. And the farmers actually were mostly on their own for perhaps a decade or more. And that same problem you can still see today, where farmers are on their own, specifically the pioneer farmers, and they just go through this process on their own of adaptation and learning. And later on, some technical people, researchers, extension officers, universities come on board, and they start to help the farmers. Right, so in the United States, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, it developed, and a lot of elements of the system came together, like the cropping side, the soil side, the implement side was really important to get the right implements. In other words, the no-till planters, the no-till planters that could do the job. It was a really challenging and important innovation breakthrough to get the right no-till planters for the farmers to do the proper no-till practices, which is a major element of the system. And then later on, the system expanded in the United States, to other countries as well, to Canada, Southern American states like Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, etc., which at this stage has a huge, very high level of adoption of conservation agriculture. And then it spread to Australia, for example, which also at this stage has a huge very high level of adoption of conservation agriculture. And even in the 80s, it spread, it came to South Africa. In the KwaZulu-Natal province, they started with a couple of farmers with the technical people, started to experiment with it, and they actually also learned from Rhodesia at that stage, which was, they were actually before us starting with conservation agriculture. So there was a bit of cross-pollination with our neighbors in the then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. And then it started in KwaZulu-Natal, and later on in the 80s even with pioneer farmers. In the 80s it started with pioneer farmers, Jack Iman in the Western Cape, and people like Anthony Meeret in KwaZulu-Natal. They started it with technical people. Western Cape in the 80s already. So it was quite a long time ago if you think about it. And the pioneer farmers with the technical people were really key in this whole process. We could come back to that story a bit later, because that's really important, how this thing spread among farmers. So maybe I stop there for the moment.
If I may, what I think Hendrik is also alluding to is the fact that you had an ecological debt because of the farming practice. What is mentioned in the 30s in the Dust Bowl, and then the financial trouble that was a result. So the ecological debt led to a financial debt. And what we often see is that the ecological domain or sphere and the financial domain of sphere operates in complete isolation from each other, as if the other doesn't exist. So when you go into a discussion around borrowing money, it is staring at a spreadsheet, does it make sense, assumptions, etc., and then yes, you get money or finances or not. And it's decoupled from the ecological environmental realities. Whereas these two are actually so much intertwined. So what I think Hendrik is also alluding to is that it's not just in the ecological debt and the financial debt that sort of became a vicious circle, that there's a flip side to it, where if you can heal the land through regenerative agriculture, and you can actually build the soil up again so that the soil can become vibrant and healthy with all sorts of microbes active in it, then that will also help you on the financial side, which is then the benefits of restoration, which we spoke about earlier. And then you change from a vicious circle into a virtuous circle. Because of the interaction between the ecological debt, financial debt, or then the ecological prosperity, regeneration, and then the financial regeneration. It's basically therefore this, what you've mentioned, Hendrik, if I understand that correctly, there's a transition through adoption of these practices, which is the key barrier, is in order for people to then say, I am going to adopt, in order to get out of this vicious circle into this virtuous circle. And much of the work in the research and everything that you've mentioned, also the pioneer farmers, are about actually making this switch, this conversion possible. Because the resources are there, the technology are there, the pioneer farmers are there, the evidence is out there. So the barrier now is this adoption to change.
Yes, and if I just can come in here, it is really difficult for farmers to make that switch. Sometimes I don't know how they do it, because it's like this oiled machine that is working perfectly. They understand the system, the current conventional system, 100%, how it works and functions, and they just drive it. Now it's like this oiled machine or the huge ship that they need to turn around. And the question is, why, how? And those are the questions that they ask, and it's not easy. And that's why I think the role of the pioneers so important and really powerful.
Yeah, but I don't even think the roles of the pioneers, the roles of what you play as well in asset research and that, is where you actually do the trials and that, or where you actually put the financials together with the whole issue. Because, and it's coming back to the economics again, because it's not only disconnected on the ecological services and and the financials in that, is that I think it's our problem that everything that we do in silos. So you've got the bank that sits there, and I mean, even the banks just talk on yields. They are financial institutions and actually should look at profit per hectare or whatever, not what is your yield going to be, because a yield is not a determination of profit, and they don't bank yields. So it's a funny, what's your yield going to be? Because so if you take, and where I think that is where it's crucial that. That's why we're also doing this video or this series of videos, and that is to show that there are people that can actually back it up. Because I think that if you take any of the pioneer farmers, they all say it's a lonely road. They're on their own in their areas or whatever. So that it can be done. I mean, they've shown it already. So, and I want to bring you back, Hendrik, a bit to the, just to actually so that you give more figures, especially on the erosion costs and that it's not how much topsoil do we actually lose and that, what are those costs to the industry. And I don't know, James, if you want to also come in and actually talk about what is the agricultural debt compared to the GDP and that as well.
So what I can share is a study that was done a couple of years ago by Dr. Gerry. He was a colleague of me. So he looked at the water erosion rates in South Africa, in the whole South Africa, and on the different land management systems. And one of the figures that stands out is the average long-term soil erosion. Soil loss from water erosion is 13 tons per hectare per year, just from water erosion.
That's on croplands.
Yeah, that's on croplands, yes. So that means if you compare it with the maize produced, for every ton of maize, you lose about 3 tons of soil every year under the predominantly conventional systems that we have at the moment. So that's a huge cost just from water erosion. Now, I think we don't have good figures on wind erosion, specifically in the western parts of South Africa, but I think the rates must be more or less the same. So that's only erosion. There's also other chemical and biological and physical soil degradation processes going on. I don't have good figures on the economical cost of that. Maybe James does, but yeah.
So, I mean, the way to then mitigate or to offset that soil erosion is to use high external inputs. And high external inputs are extremely expensive. And even this year, we have seen the cost of fertilizers sort of spiraling out of control. So, currently, the debt, agricultural debt, runs into about 190 billion rand for 2020, 2021, with the GDP of agriculture around about 85 billion rand. So, I mean, it's a huge disparity between what the GDP is, or the income generated by the agricultural sector, compared then with the debt book. Now, it's a bit of an awkward comparison because debt is what we call a stock variable, so whereas income and GDP is a flow variable, so the comparison is a little bit awkward, but you have to service the debt out of your income. And that ratio of the level of indebtedness has spiraled out of control. So at the moment we sit with a ratio there of basically 87% of people's income that needs to go into external resources and external inputs, which means that the margins are increasingly thinner and thinner and thinner. So in order to be able then to address those narrow margins, there's the drive towards yield, as you have mentioned. But the drive towards yield can only be done if you add more external inputs. So we're back into our vicious circle. To service the debt, more yield requires more external inputs requires more upfront costs and loan accounts, which add to the debt. And then we haven't even spoken about the effects of climate extremes. So the moment that you introduce climate extremes into that scenario, the farmer becomes extremely vulnerable, because the natural capital that he's got, his land, his soil, is increasingly depleted from nutrients, increasingly depleted from the capacity to sustain life. But in that context then, his land, the asset that he's got, the natural capital that he's got, is losing resilience. So it cannot withstand climate extremes. Put that into the other context then of a farmer that has made this jump to conservation and regenerative agriculture, where he's building up his natural capital, his resource, and the soil becomes vibrant and alive. Now that soil is resilient, and it can actually buffer these climate extremes. So we have to think also in terms of agriculture going forward, how resilient is your system to withstand extremes? Because if your system is not resilient to withstand extremes, the debt spiral is going to go ballistic, which is very, very disconcerting. And what is a plausible thing that's going to happen is that the farmers who's going to be able to withstand these extremes would be your farmers who actually has made this conversion because their land is simply can handle the extremes because it's more resilient from an ecological space. And so we see the connection against the financial capital sort of sphere and the ecological sphere again. If you want to protect your financial capital, you have to protect your ecological capital, because from a resilience perspective. And I think I think is also going to trigger the adoption increase, so that farmers are starting to accelerate in the adoption of conservation agriculture, simply from a pure logic perspective and from a land resilience perspective.
Just coming back on, and I don't want to harp on the negative side of it, because we've actually got to bring home to the solution as well, because that's much more interesting than we know we're in trouble. So I mean, it is. But you also wrote an article in the Daily Maverick in regards to this whole debt lending, to that it actually becomes, according to the new, what's it called?
Well, it's basically reckless lending.
Yeah, reckless lending, exactly.
So reckless lending is according to the Act, you cannot really be considered, the bank cannot really be considered as providing a lending in a reckless manner to a company or to a large corporate institution, because it's considered that the person applying for that money must have done his own due diligence. So reckless lending in the strict terms of the law only applies to consumers and people to protect the individual from piracy in that sense. But that is in terms of the letter of the law. But in terms of the spirit of the law, what it actually is saying is that a financial institution, a lending organization, should not provide an institution or a person or an applicant money, debt, if they very well know that that person is going to be more exposed to more debt going forward. Especially if the financial lending institution is supposed to have knowledge of a few things. They have to have the knowledge of what the trajectory is with respect to external input costs. They are supposed to know what is the likelihood of the increase in intensity and frequency of extreme events. So they, as a financial institution, as an industry, is supposed to have that foreknowledge that if they're going to make this money available to the applicant, and the applicant is using practices that is likely to lead to further erosion of his natural capital, that the financial lenders or lending institutions are putting that applicant in further risk. So in the terms of the spirit of the law, the financial institutions are in the wrong, all of them. Yes, not in terms of the letter of the law, and that's why you can't go and sue them for reckless lending, because it is specifically aimed at individual consumers and not as corporates or big companies. But it is contravening the spirit of that law, because the financial lending organizations and institutions, they all know what the milieu is within which agriculture is operating. There's not one of them that does not know what that milieu is. And they know very well that the practices that they are supporting through their lending mechanisms are leading to further erosion of the natural capital, which, given the connection between natural capital and financial capital, is leading to the farmers into a deeper debt trap situation, which I find very disconcerting, actually.
Coming to the solution, and I mean it's really about carbon. That is what it's about. We are about carbon-based life. Hendrik, coming back to you and that, and on the 6 principles of soil health and that, because I think that is what let's get the solutions. And I mean, you've really done the research on it and busy doing it with your team and that. If you can actually elaborate on that.
Yes, Gerry, as we said, farmers started to experiment with a couple of ideas, and later on at this stage, we've identified the principles and practices that came out of this whole process of learning and adaptation right across the world. And the principles are then put into a system of conservation or regenerative agriculture, whatever you want to call it. And farmers then have a really good guideline of principles that they can use to, in their own context, try to adapt them and make their farms more resilient, as James said, and more sustainable and vibrant.
Yeah. I think this, and what people don't get is the context. You've got to do it in your context. I mean, I know in change management and that as well, it's the why. You must really know why you're doing this. The how is easy. Like you say, you've got enough people that we can go to a couple of people to actually look at what they're doing and copy it. But you must really know your context and why do you want to do that?
Absolutely. So context, every farmer's context is different. Actually, every field on every farm's context is different. So because farmers might have the same soils or climate next to each other, but they have different ideas, values, financial situations, objectives, implements, and so on. So the context of every situation is different, and you need to adapt those principles in that specific context. And the farmer is the only guy who can do that. You can get a lot of advice and inspiration and ideas from elsewhere, and that's what happens. But eventually, and sooner than later, he or she has to do it right there, in his fields, on his own farm.
But see, Hendrik, I think you are saying something very important here. We've all been trained in terms of recipes, in terms of, well, actually surviving life and do whatever we do, also with respect to the farmer. And what you are saying and you're stressing are the principles. So regenerative agriculture, conservation agriculture is much more an approach than a recipe.
Yeah, systems approach. Yeah.
And once you embrace the approach, that's where the context really becomes very big. Because now it is not to say, Farmer Joe, you must do A, B, C, and D and go down a checklist and then you'll have success. You have to embrace that context and go on this approach in order to make it work. So, whereas if you follow a recipe-based approach, it's possible for the farmer to almost be distant from the operation. Whereas it's a regenerative approach, the farmer is centerfold. I mean, he's the key person there.
Yeah. He actually takes accountability for it.
Yes, it's a continuous trial and error learning adaptation process by the farmer on his farm, in his field. It's a lifelong process or journey that he starts of adapting and learning.
I heard a nice, it was in a farmer's day in Namibia where the guy explained what is regenerative agriculture. And he said it's a Kalahari pad and it's a double pad. Hy loop opdraande, it goes uphill and it never ends.
Exactly.
you can't see the end.
And I think just sort of on this point, and I think it is that journey that the financial lending institutions struggle to see.
Yes.
Because their financial lending cycle is 6 months period. It's this crop season.
Yes.
And they don't see that this journey of perhaps 10, 20, 30 years going forward. And so you actually need a huge philosophical change by the farmer, by the supporting institutions, entities, research institutions, also the financial institutions that has to, in a sense, change in a synchronized manner to say, hey guys, we're in for the long haul here. It is an appeal in order to change it around, but let's not even contemplate the alternative, because that is just like tragic. I mean, let's not even go there. So we are in this as an agricultural system, which includes obviously also the entire value chain. So it includes the wholesaler, the retailer, and the consumer in this process.
I said it just now, it's all of a sudden, if you don't follow the recipe, if you to put it into your context, you actually take accountability. If you always follow the recipe, you can listen to any rep.
Yeah, they just wait for the rep for the recipe for the year. And
if it doesn't work, the rep says it either rained too much or too little, and if he doesn't get a harvest, then it didn't rain enough, or we didn't get rain, so he can always blame something else. So, and no one is exempt from taking accountability for his actions. Actually.
Absolutely. So, no, you're right. Yeah. And the key to the solution in this journey is innovation capacity or adaptive capacity. Because the better the farmer can innovate in the moment, in the process, the better he will be able to adapt his system in that moment, because every moment is almost different. Every season is different.
That takes guts, eh?
Very much guts and grace and knowledge, because what we're also referring to here is the other big problem is ignorance and a lack of knowledge, because it's a whole new system. And everybody need to have that mind shift, but supported by a lot of insights and knowledge and understanding of how nature, ecology works, how the principles works, how the financial model will work over a long term. So the ignorance and bridging that gap, the knowledge gap, is really key that we need to achieve.
I mean, it's a silo thinking that we have. This is what you do. The other people do this and this, and we all of a sudden, it's the same as why the unforeseen consequences of using a chemical. I mean, we all know it. It has to kill something. What else it kills on your predator-prey relation in your natural services systems that is never taken into account. So I mean, it is really stepping out of your comfort zone. I mean, it really is. You say it's a risk,
Massive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hendrik, so there was context. Now let's start, because I think one of the big problems, also if you talk to farmers in South Africa and whatever, they know the principles of soil health. And just to gain, coming back on the carbon life, because the higher your carbon, and let me put you into this again, James, just so that you can actually, because I know you probably know the figures off by heart, the higher your carbon, the better your water penetration and also retention, and the more drought resilient your farm actually does become. If you could just actually elaborate on that.
Well, you're asking an economist to respond to that with a soil scientist sitting next to him. So,
okay, so you can say, in all due respect, I'll I'll hand over to
if I
Hendrik.
may.
So I will give that as a hospital pass to the soil scientist.
No, Hendrik, you can. I mean, it's.
But before it catches the ball, while it's running, so looking for the ball, we just have to realize that everything that you've mentioned in that sentence does have a monetary value attached to it. The carbon, the water, the soil nutrients, the crop production, the diesel usage, the chemical usage. Every single item in that basket comes with a cost, and if you don't have it, with an opportunity cost, meaning you have to compensate with it in one or other way. And so, again, this sort of deeply tied connection between what happens in the soil and what happens in your wallet. And we often get this sort of big disconnect between the two. But the water, the nutrients, the chemicals, the bugs, the bees, the butterflies, they're all linked to your wallet in one way or another. And if you're not managing that carefully, then it's going to cost you money, a lot. If you manage it properly and your system is resilient and regenerated, then you're going to feel it in your wallet as well. Water infiltration and carbon.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. So everything that we do, well, the big focus would be on soil health, improving soil health. Because if your soil health improves, then everything else falls in place. Water infiltration, water holding capacity, soil fertility, diseases in soil-borne diseases, climate change, and the key parameter or indicator in the soil is organic carbon. So we all try to measure, but also build and improve the levels of soil organic carbon in the soil through the practices that we want to implement. And those principles are actually the key ones that we need to do as best as possible in our context to be able to have that desired impact on our soil health. So the first principle is minimum soil disturbance, and that's primarily mechanical disturbance through tillage, but it could also be chemical disturbance through pesticides, fertilizers, etc., in judicious use of those inputs, but also biological disturbance. So you've got to be careful, because the moment you disturb your soil, specifically mechanical disturbance through tillage, you start that spiral of downwards soil degradation. And people forget that. The moment you disturb your soil, that's what starts that soil degradation process. So the second principle is permanent organic soil cover. And that means you need to protect your soil with either dead material, crop residues, or living plants like cover crops, which we'll come back to. And that protects the soil against elements of nature like rain and sun. It helps the water to infiltrate in the soil and move into the soil, but also prevents runoff and erosion. It also cools down the soil from the effect of the sun. The third principle is diversity. I call it diversity. That means we want as many crops, plants, animals in the system as possible. Now here we talk about crop rotations, associations, double cropping, etc. But we also talk about the integration of livestock into our systems. We could elaborate later on how we exactly do that. That is also tied to another principle, which is permanent living roots in the soil, because the living roots is actually feeding the soil life in below the surface, and it all starts from the sun. The sun provides the energy for the photosynthesis process, pulling down the carbon from the air into the plants, using the water in the soil, building carbon in the plants, but a percentage of that carbon is released through the roots into the soil, feeding this life, the biology, the soil food web that builds healthy soils. And those are the principles that we have developed and identified and refined over decades that became the system of conservation or regenerative agriculture.
But if you look at it, it's not really much different from how nature works anyhow.
Yeah.
It works with diversity, it works with photosynthesis and the living root system in order to feed the soil, so that the soil then can feed the organisms, and the organisms can make the nutrients available to the plants, and the plants can then flourish, and the plants that flourishes then provides food for animals and humans. So it is basically taking the natural system and adapt it in the best possible way in the context where you are in a transformed landscape. So yes, we realize that a farm is a transformed landscape. But how can you take those principles that occurs in nature and apply it in the best possible way in your specific context? Because the more you have the diversity in, the more you will immediately get species diversity as well. So you get your pollinators in. But with the pollinators that you get in, you also get your raptors in, and the prey that can deal with your pests on your farm and help you to manage the farm better and be cheaper, because that's for free. You don't pay them. And
sorry, just on that case, if a dung beetle buries 75% of the internal parasites that a ruminant excretes.
Wow.
Yeah, and through dipping, through internal and external parasite control, chemically now, we often harm the dung beetles. So once again, it becomes what you've lost. You've actually you have to put an external input into it.
So why must we pay for something which is killing something which would have done the same job for free?
Yeah.
I mean, you're losing in both directions, actually big time. And by trying to mimic nature's patterns here in a transformed landscape, you can actually develop quite nutritious food, because eventually, as we all know, I mean, the food can only have the nutrition in it what it receives out of the soil. And if the soil is depleted of nutrients, then the plant will be deficient of those nutrients, and then we'll get a nutrient deficient food. But if the soil is healthy, resilient with a lot of nutrients being made available through the living root system to the plant, then that will feed into the crop, and then eventually onto our plate. And so the direct connection between what the farmer is actually doing on his farm and the approach that he is taking, and the quality of the food we're eating.
Yeah, and then you can take it further, not only on his farm, what he does in his soil, I know that's what you mean by it, but also it has a direct link to human health. And that's where if you take nutrient deficiency, that our food, and that's documented, that our food minerals have nearly halved since the Second World War because of the Green Revolution and stuff like that. If you take, and I just want to say to the farmers that think that they cannot do this, every paradise has its snake. So it doesn't matter if you've got lots of water, no water. If you're on sweet or sour veld, that's got nothing. That's where the context becomes so crucial that everybody can actually do this. If you've got the more water you have, the easier it is. But you've got other challenges.
Yeah.
The less water you have, the more urgently you actually have to do this.
Definitely.
The drier areas and that.
Yeah.
Well, just on that, in terms of the temporal effects that we discussed earlier, the more arid environments, the restoration effect does take longer. I mean, the more temperate and the more moist an environment is, the more forgiving it is, provided that you don't have too much of it, as you said. But the time of restoration actually becomes shorter, which actually then challenges the situation that for the people in the more temperate and more moist environments, the time to recovery is relatively short, so do it. And then for the people in the more arid environments, the time to recovery is long, start now.
Yeah. You should have started.
You should have started.
So if we can add soil types in that equation, then it makes it even more difficult. Arid environments with sandy soils is really difficult to build carbon and to build to get restoration done properly. So yes, the people and farmers that understand and live in those conditions know the best how to go about and how to adapt some of these principles to make it work.
The interesting thing is that there are people doing it. It's not.
Yes.
I mean, it's not that no one has ever tried it. There are people that do it.
That's right.
Also and I think that's where the animal integration comes in as well. One, the risk of an animal is not as high as a cash crop. You don't need a cash crop in the Kalahari. You don't have to.
No.
I mean, I know some people do it. Well, it's again context. Do they have enough water for it? But the risk of animals on land is not as high as a cash crop.
Yes.
Even in the Eastern Free State and that as well. I mean, it is. If you want, I don't know if you want to discuss the animal integration and the profits per hectare rather than.
Yeah, well, I'll pass the profit ball to the economist next door. But yes, the animal integration is key. As we said, diversity is really one of the very important principles that we use in the system. And almost all grain farmers have livestock, but they've always kept it quite separately. They've kept the livestock system separate from the crop system. Now we say, no, let's look at it and treat it as one system, a holistic system, and bring the animals into the cropping system and look at the mutual benefits of each towards one system. So the way we do it is to use cover crops as a rotation crop between cash crops. Let's say between maize and soybean in the east, we plant one season of multi-species summer and winter cover crops. Right.
So have you done that over a year or over 2 years already?
Well, you have to do it over a long period. Are you referring to
on that specific field now?
So you can do it in one season. So you rotate cash crops, let's say maize season, with cover crops and livestock season, followed by another cash crop like soybean. So the biodiverse or the multi-species cover crop system is one piece of innovation and technology that we really need to understand much better. What species we need to put together, in which areas, how long, when do we have to plant it. So the management of the cover crop system is really key. And then come in the livestock. It could be cattle, it could be sheep, pigs, chicken, combination of it, whatever it's possible in that situation. So you bring in the livestock, grazing it on the multi-species cover crop in the right manner. So that's another kind of technology that we need to master and perfect through proper management. So the livestock integration on the multi-species cover crop, you can see the biodiversity there in terms of numbers of species of plants and animals. Has a huge impact on the soil health, but also on the above ground biodiversity, like dung beetles, insects, birds and so on just increased tremendously. So the impact on the soil came through the grazing effects, through the crops, through the harvesting of the sun's energy, through photosynthesis into the soil, but also from the impact of the livestock, through the grazing effect, through the dung, saliva, the urine, has a huge positive effects on the soil health in terms of biology specifically, because that's where it starts, and then the rest builds from there.
So in such a system where you've got a cash crop, cover crop, mixed with livestock, followed by another cash crop, on the same piece of hectare, we can see then that the net primary productivity of that hectare is increasing a lot. Compare that to where you have a system where there's a monocrop and then the land is laid fallow for 6-7 months of the year, just then to be deep tilled again and the soil exposed to the elements, where the net primary productivity is limited to a couple of months, supported with high external inputs. So what does it mean that we actually improve the net primary productivity of that specific hectare? It means a couple of things. The one is that you've got much more biomass per hectare available. But not just more biomass per hectare available, there's also the insects and the species that is in support that is much more per hectare. Which basically means that when come the next season, you definitely don't want to have the soil disturbance, because then you're going to destroy that very thing that you've just built up. But in the process, speaking to the profit idea, is that you are starting to layer different income streams on the same hectare. Whereas if you go the monocropping laying fallow system, you've got one bite at the cherry basically for that season and for the year. Whereas you start to follow this approach, you have several bites at the cherry, and you can actually then start to get multiple of income streams out of the same hectare. Now it is no longer a challenge to say, can I get 8, 9, 10, 12 tons per hectare from this specific hectare, because if I don't get this yield, I've got a problem. Now the objective is to say, how can I, in a layered approach, by having multiple income streams from the same unit of land, actually maximize that. So now the goal function is no longer maximize yield, but maximize profit out of a layered approach. So you have also diversity in terms of your income streams. So the ecological diversity then supports a diversity in income streams, which obviously helps the bottom line to a great deal. And in that context, the one resilience supports the other resilience, which I think is very, very exciting. But what Hendrik has mentioned also now is in terms of with the livestock integration, you've mentioned the word dung beetle. I don't think we understand the key role of dung beetles in the ecosystem. As master engineers, to take the manure and to work that manure into the soil, assist the process of carbon buildup, as well as then providing nutrients in the soil. You really don't want to destroy or take dung beetles out of your system. But the moment that you've got dung beetles, you will all have other things as well in the system. Your birds and the ladybirds and everything else will be there, which then supports the ecosystem going forward.
I just, while James was mentioning the layered approach and the benefits of those, just want to mention or describe one example that I've recently experienced, and that is the farm of Loeverland in the Prieska area of Bertie-Coetzee, if I may. So he's got this wonderful, diverse regenerative agriculture system with lots of different components, of layers of incomes and systems. I just want to mention a few, those I can remember. He's got a grain system, organic production of different wheat species, and then also in rotation with organic maize. And then he rotates that with cover crops. The cover crops are grazed with livestock. It could be cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and all those elements have a specific niche market. And he sells this basket of products, all from different components of his system, to different markets, to different niche markets. He also has export wines from his vineyards, and in between the vineyards he manages the crops, or the cover crops and the weeds and the soil fertility with what do you call it, big mobiles, pigs moving between the vineyards and fertilizing the soil, etc.
I think Bert is he's probably our poster boy if it comes to the others as well. But I mean, if you take it, and just to bring the context into it again, I think and I speak under correction, but I think for him to get a harvest of organic maize or crop, it takes him 2 years to prepare the field to actually be able to do that. So it's yes. So I mean, it's just so that the people understand how you must really understand your context. Yeah. And it's again, if
time is important.
Time is important, and timing is everything for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Time is very important. But in the system that you've just explained, it's about growing the biomass.
Yes.
But now, if you grow the biomass, well, how do you get rid of it? Because eventually you actually would like to have a cash crop in it again. So what we've seen in numerous occasions is that through applying this regenerative principles, the number of animals that land can support increases dramatically. So whereas let's say you have your large stock units or hectares per large stock unit figures, and let's say it's 5 hectares on a large stock unit. By starting to apply this principle, you can actually increase the carrying capacity considerable. And now your hectare is working harder in that sense as well. So it's not just that you've got this basket approach or multi-layered approach, it's also that it actually can carry more animals because you have produced more biomass on the land.
I mean, Barry Meyer down in the Rust, in the Klein Karoo or whatever,
Yes.
he carries 65 animals on 25 hectares.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I nearly fell off my chair when I heard. I mean, it's fascinating, and it's yeah. I just want to come back a bit to how the principles actually, because often farmers actually think, well, I do no-till, so I'm already a conservation or a regenerative farmer or whatever. It's a start. It's not this is, like we said, it's a process. You've got to start somewhere. No-till is probably the best way to actually start. But just to give on the mycorrhizal fungi and that, if you have a degraded field, a maize field now, we all know it. If you go and it's you've ploughed it for the last 50 years, you don't have a lot of spores left, because the spores only live for about a month after they've detached from a living root to actually get an energy source, because they can't make their own energy.
Yeah,
You've said it often enough. They've actually got to get it from photosynthesis. If you break the hyphae, it breaks, and that is a problem. They've got little nodules that have enough energy for a month. Just to bring the principles together. To restore that mycorrhizal fungi again in that field, you need a living root for about 2 years or 18 months to 2 years, so that the hyphae can actually make spores again. Because that's where the fallow period destroys this whole concept, is where your mycorrhizal starts growing. It doesn't make any spores because it's got enough space to spread out, and as soon as it can't spread anymore, then it actually starts making spores. And that's where you want to get with your soil health as well, so that the mycorrhizal fungi can actually make spores, because they're the highway.
Yeah, what you're actually saying, Gerry, is that you need all the principles
Yes.
applied as best as possible in your context for as long as possible.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you won't have the desired effect on your soil health, on all the other ecosystem services, and eventually on your financial situation. You really need to try and understand that you cannot only do no-till and everything will fall in place. You need to try your best to adapt all these principles.
Yeah.
And it's not easy. I mean, specifically, let's take one example, to bring in animals. It's really challenging for farmers, specifically those who don't have enough animals or no animals, to suddenly start to convince the banks to get
Yes,
them money to
I think
buy
that,
animals.
yeah.
That is a big problem. So it's not easy.
Yeah, but that's a problem with our financial institutions
Yeah.
as
Yeah,
well.
definitely.
I mean, I know why they don't do it, because there have been people, but you don't have to. They know their clients.
Yeah.
They know the clients that aren't going to run away or whatever. And I mean, they can change their attitude to actually
Yeah.
financing animals or livestock, at least better livestock.
But some farmers don't know how to bring their animals, from that side of the farm into their cropping
Yes.
system. It's a new thing. It's they first need to train themselves, to practice until they get it right, and then they can scale it up to the rest of their farms. It's a totally new thing, and they make mistakes, and that's part of the game. You need to make those mistakes to learn and to make sure that you really perfect it at the end of the day. But it's like we said, it's a lifelong journey of trial and error, learning and adapt.
But two things on this, Gerry, Hendrik, and that is that I think there's quite good evidence from work done, especially in the Western Cape, which they were pioneers as well with the no-till concepts, and no-till adoption rates are very, very high in the Western Cape. But where cover crops have not been introduced, and you haven't seen the carbon buildup. And the moment that the cover crops are introduced, and then with animals, then you see the carbon buildup happening. So, and I understand now from what you have said in terms of the importance of bringing in the cover crop, bringing in the species, the living root, in order to actually assist the mycorrhiza and to grow the mycorrhiza. And if you don't do that, then the no-till in isolation is not going to give you the soil carbon that you would like. I mean, yes, so you have therefore to look at this different context and apply the principles in the best way possible on your land, but only no-till is not going to give you that carbon benefits that you need. But the study groups that Hendrik is facilitating has given us a large number of, let's call it in a sense, showcases. So if there's a farmer that is keen to say, but how does this work? Then probably the best way is stoop talk. Go to somebody that is applying it one way or another and learn from those examples. It's not that the country does not have those examples. They're in virtually all contexts in the country. There are pioneer farmers, as Hendrik has mentioned. That's very exciting to know what they're doing, to see what they're doing, to see these results, and that has provided us with a degree of critical mass already as a country as a whole, in order from where we can develop conservation agriculture, regenerative agriculture going forward. It's not that we start from scratch.
No.
It's not a blank page. And for that, we have to acknowledge and give credit to those pioneer farmers that you have mentioned in the 80s and long before extension services were available, long before literature was there, who started this process of adaptation and learning and experimenting and searching out different ways, and for various different reasons that they have embarked on those journeys. But we have to acknowledge them and what they've achieved. And as a result of what they've done, there are these multiple number of living real case examples from which one then can learn to take it forward.
Gerry, I think it's a beautiful story that we can look into and talk about what happened with the adoption process of conservation agriculture in South Africa. Well, it's the same story right across the world, and James just referred again to the key role of pioneer farmers that started it all. Just one point before I quickly tell that beautiful story. All farmers in the South African Highveld, in the grain crop area of South Africa, started with conservation agriculture without any support, official research extension support. So that's an interesting point in its own. And that says that farmers are the key innovators in this process. And we need to accept that, understand that, and reward them where possible, and also acknowledge and use them as the key innovators.
So no state support, no industry
Nothing.
support.
Nothing.
Yeah, but I mean, I think the industry support is understandable because they want to reduce the input costs. So, and it's also the academics. Unfortunately, the academics get paid by big ag, and that is a. I mean, that's also
Not all of them.
not all of asset research sits there on its.
But then came the pioneer conservation farmers, the lead farmers, and they started to see there's something wrong, and they started to do something, and somehow they learned about these few principles, and then they started to apply it, and they brought people together, study groups, in no-till clubs, etc., and they learned together, and the circle grew. We also call it innovation platforms, study groups, innovation systems, whatever. And then other people like input suppliers also came in, because the no-till planter suppliers are really key in this process. And so the pioneer farmers with their groups, their structures are really the basis of the spread of conservation agriculture. And then the input suppliers. And where we found where the input suppliers, specifically those guys selling the no-till planters, also sold the system, they made a huge difference in terms of the spread of conservation agriculture. And then farmers started to go on these cross visits to other districts and other provinces, to KwaZulu-Natal and Western Cape, to learn from those early adopters in those provinces. And then they also went overseas, to Argentina, to United States, to Australia, to learn from them already in the 80s, 90s. A lot of these pioneer farmers spent years going across and learn to other areas and other farmers, to other pioneer farmers and groups. And then when social media started, they jumped onto that, and they said YouTube. They learned from YouTube, from pioneer farmers like Guy Brown, who has huge amount of YouTube videos, from pioneer researchers like Elaine Ingham, Christine Jones, Ray Arculeta, and those guys. They just learned so much from those icons in conservation or regenerative agriculture. And then obviously awareness events, farmers' days, conferences, also help to spread.
I mean, I find it fascinating. If you take the Landbou Weekblad ter Lewenslandbou conference or whatever, I mean, it's 600 people that came.
Yeah.
And I mean, they pay quite a.
Up
They
to
pay,
600 people.
and I mean, it's countrywide that they come from. If you take the tours that really Pretorius always did to the US, I mean, those weren't cheap, and the guys actually went to go and learn.
Yeah.
So I don't think the uptake is going to go quicker if you take the Farmers' Days. How many young people go to these herlewing or to these regen days, and that it's fascinating.
Yes.
But see, Gerry, I think it works 2 or 3 ways here simultaneously. There's the outreach programs, those conferences that you've mentioned, quite a few of them, and which has got a big footprint. That one conference where we met a few years ago, the farmers who were there at that one conference represents 20% of the maize farmers of South Africa, hectare-wide.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a huge area. And so, in other words, the outreach is there, the information is there, and now we're gradually seeing the improvement in the adoption rate. But I think you've mentioned the word the younger people and so on, and I think there we have to also think in terms of the customers, the pressure from customers. And because we see that increasingly happening, both from domestic sources as well as from international sources. The customers are also watching YouTube.
Yes. Yeah.
And they also see the things from social media. And they're also sensitized that, hey guys, but there's another way of farming that's out there. A manner of farming that actually does not hurt the environment. There's a manner of farming that can actually heal the environment, and that can contribute positively to society in general. We've spoken about costs earlier, and the costs, and I just want to touch on one element there. So when you have depleted soils, which is nutrient deprived, then the food will be nutrient deprived. But then it will lead into all kinds of human diseases, and then you look at what those disease costs are to the customer and the client and the consumer thereof. Now, I mean, it will have to take a very brave person to try and quantify that quantum, but it will be an astronomical number.
I mean, sorry, just on that, I had there's a video also with Stephanie Seneff that did it on glyphosate. Just the effects of and it's not only glyphosate. Let's leave glyphosate out of it and actually just call them endocrine disruptors. The endocrine disruption of chemicals, and not only in the agricultural sphere, on diabetes, autism, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, infertility in men. Now, I mean, it's a huge problem. Women that with polycystic ovaries and stuff like that, just because the endocrine system was stuffed up in when they were a fetus still. You quantify that. So
it's astronomical.
It is. It's a huge cost and that's not even taking just the nutrient deficiency of our soil into account. If you take all the chronic diseases into account as well, it's scary. It's frightening.
And so if we then take the customers are starting to become sensitive around that.
Yeah.
So what I think we could look forward to is that we've got this critical mass of farmers which has to be commended with all possible strongest terms possible for the work that they've done in adopting conservation and regenerative agriculture, healing the land, helping the system to become more resilient, and in the process produce improved food, nutrient-rich food. There's a customer base that's increasingly also becoming aware and educated about these matters. And so I think we can look forward to an agri-industry, agri-business that's going to develop around this, and that it is no longer just the elite that can buy super-produced food at a price premium. It has to become available to everybody, so that we can actually address the food deficit for everybody. I mean, it cannot remain something that can only go into a specific brand at a specific premium for a specific niche group. That's in a sense unethical, I think. It has to become available broad-based, and that I'm sure is going to happen as more and more farmers are starting to make this adoption.
Gerry, there's also another group that is positioning themselves within this whole new movement of regenerative agriculture, and that is the service providers, the technical service providers, because they also have to go through this mind shift from providing recipes to actually start working with farmers and helping farmers to adapt their system. So they need a whole new approach, mindset, and set of skills. So what it actually requires is for us as technical service providers to to recognize what is going on. And that is to recognize, but there's actually a very innovative process driven by farmers already going on. So the philosophy that we follow is we approach this farmer movement with care, realizing that whatever we do should actually strengthen this process, not breaking it down. So it's eventually a participatory approach where we start to work with farmers, sit around the table, and start asking what and how can we help you, and where can we form joint activities and partnerships to make this thing work much better and quicker. So that kind of participatory systems or innovations approaches that we follow, it's the philosophy, the farmer-centered principle is important, where we eventually, some of the key activities that we plan and implement on the ground are, for example, on-farm trials, where farmers are really the key researchers in these the on-farm trial experimentation process. We test really interesting treatments from conventional to normal CA systems to regenerative agriculture systems. We test the impact of those on soils, on ecosystems, on the financial situation of farmers. Really interesting data that we explore and derive from these on-farm trials. Other important activities that we do with farmers are the farmers' days or the conferences, where we really just expose people as much as possible to the innovative things that we do with the farmers on the ground in these projects in different regions. And then also write articles, make videos, just try to share the message as far and wide and quickly as possible. So that the approach is really key in trying to build this movement of conservation agriculture effectively.
Yeah, I think what you said just now is where the farmer is a researcher, and that is, he's got better local knowledge of his context than anybody else.
Absolutely.
And I think that is what we've got to learn from him, is that his context, and actually share it. And that's I think that is the interesting thing of this, is that they are so willing to share.
Oh yes.
So I mean, it's
yeah. And who else can do those trials than them? They've got the implements.
Yeah.
We don't. They've got the land, the soil, the knowledge of that context. Nobody else can do it.
But what you are actually alluding to, Hendrik, is in a sense the elephant in the room, also with respect to the university curriculum. And does that address that specific request or requirements from the farmers? And currently it is not exclusively but generally aimed towards plant and animal genetics, and not so much systems management.
Yeah.
So obviously plant and animal genetics are obviously important, but if you think in terms of a conservation agriculture, regenerative agriculture, and your opening question that spoke about restoration, we actually should get the ecologists on board as well to help us with this restoration. Restoration ecologists are the one group of people out there, scientists out there, that understand systems and how to actually restore degraded systems. Imagine where you have a situation where restoration ecologists and farmers can actually work together collaboratively in terms of how can we heal this land in a way that it can actually enhance productivity to produce better food, and in the process add onto the bottom line and be very nice and kind to the wallet. We have to think a little bit broader about what sort of extension service do we need. And I think restoration ecologists, for one, can play a huge role in this. So the paradigm shift, the mind shift is also in terms of who you collaborate with in this process going forward.
Yes, the training aspects of CA, like we just said, and James referred to one of the key skills that we need to bring in. At this stage, I think the universities or tertiary training institutions are starting to come to the party quite slowly, but at least in some aspects there's really exciting movements and people coming onto the scene, training students in the right direction, at least in terms of natural sciences, let's say soil science, agronomy, ecology, etc., those things, and bringing the economic side into as well. But what we also lack, and that's what we need to bring into the training as well, is the softer, the social science skills like facilitation, participatory approaches and techniques and tools. We need to join those technical, natural sciences with the social sciences and economic sciences to get the real perfect person.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a co-learning. So yes. What you talk about is co-learning, and co-learning is actually so valuable because what you learn in a co-learning process is so much more than just the substance.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, you learn the substance, but you learn so much more in that co-learning process.
And we had the discussion once. You've got hard science, let's say on the left or whatever, and you've got art on the right, and it's the observation is an art, and Stockman is an art. It's not something that someone can learn.
Yeah.
It's observation. It's your 100. What is it? 10,000 hours. If you do something 10,000 hours, you'll finally be good at it.
Yeah.
Something like that. So it's got something to do with that.
Yeah.
It's not only hard science.
No, it's a soft science as well. And we always say that, specifically working with smallholders, this design and implementation, facilitation of this approach is key in order to have any desired effect or impact on the society or on the farmers. And we always say that we're actually spending about 70% of our time in the design, facilitation of this whole process on the soft side, on the human side, on the social side, and then 30% on the pure technical side. So that is really a key part of the whole movement to get the structures in the process.
So would you say, therefore, Hendrik, that in order to increase the adoption rates, that the key to unlock that lies much more towards the softer side than on the harder side?
Definitely.
Because it is an approach, because it's a philosophy, because it is a paradigm. The harder side of things, the deep technical, deep scientific things, I mean, that's there, and I mean, the numbers are there to go with it. But it is the softer side.
Yes.
And I think we should also acknowledge that we're not always that good with the softer side of things.
No.
we're not educated or trained for that. So that's where we're pretty weak at.
Natural sciences are not learned to work with farmers, for example. And then they're sent out there into an extension research position to start to work with farmers, and they actually don't know how. So for them, it's actually a really steep learning curve. And for me personally, it was a very steep learning curve as a natural scientist to start to work with farmers. In this case, smallholder farmers from a totally different cultures.
Yeah.
So, and then, like a philosopher said, self-learning is the only real education process. But so the self-learning on the trials, co-learning in group, social learning is what we're talking about, and those are the new philosophies and concepts that we need to bring into this approach of taking it further.
I want to come back to the animal side of it, specifically the ruminants and that, because I don't think we in South Africa actually realize what the meat consumption, how that increases with wealth, especially the wealth now in the East and that also in the Middle East. If we now all of a sudden say, well, farmers must integrate animals onto their cash crop fields, are we going to get a disturbance in that the price is going to, there's going to be an oversupply. We have got export opportunities to the East and that. Coming now also to COP26 and that, where they now want to implement a tax on ruminants and that. James, and I want to bring you in here specifically because you also wrote a paper in regards to this whole thing, to ruminants and taxing meat and that. If you could actually just elaborate a bit on that, please.
So two things that you've said there, basically. The one is in terms of the global demand, and we have seen the global demand for animal-based protein skyrocketing the last 10 years, poultry, pork as well driving it, but then the beef as well, growing strongly. And there's a direct correlation in terms of societies becoming more affluent, switching then from basically a starch-based diet over to a protein-based diet. And so that market is growing it's quite a buoyant market, it's quite a strong market, as you've mentioned. And it is not one that's going to be saturated soon. The question, though, is about are animals bad for the environment, especially the ruminants or herbivores? Are they bad for the environment? And there's a statement that says, it is not the cow, it's the how. So we have to acknowledge the fact that let's speak of our context, not of other contexts, of a grassland savanna context in southern Africa. It has been, the herbivore grass interaction has been ongoing for centuries. And we have to realize that the two systems are dependent on each other. They need each other to coexist and to develop going forward. It is therefore definitely not is the cow the problem? The question is rather, what is the how in terms of how the cow or the cattle herds and the beef herds are being managed. And there are definite ways where that management could be very destructive. And we've seen the effects thereof in terms of overgrazing, soil erosion, gullies, land that's been made bare, soil that's been exposed to the sun. And then you've got all the evils that Hendrik alluded to earlier in terms of water erosion, wind erosion, and especially then in a more arid environment as well, and in a very hot environment and unforgiving environment, the ability for the grass to regenerate in such a condition is very difficult if it's getting hammered consistently. But the paper that you've alluded to, we have done a system dynamics model whereby we have taken one cow over her lifespan of about 12 years and asked the question now, if we look at the cow over her lifespan, what would be the effect of that specific individual? Because we have to realize that when carbon accounting is done, it's done at a specific point in time. So it asks the question, how big is your herd in year 2015, 2016, 2017, 2018? And when you do it in such a way, you take it actually as if there is no change in the herd composition, that it is 100 cattle, 100 head, 100 head, 100 head, as if there's no change in the composition. Whereas in reality, and I think of myself that has had a cattle herd, if you look from one year to another year, to the next year, you may have 100 cows, but the composition has changed. And over a longer period of time, even more. And each cow, going from an embryo state, fetus, calf, weaner, up to then a mature animal, becomes actually a carbon pool. And in that process is carbon out of the atmosphere, absorbed by the grass, from the grass into the herbivore, the ruminant, support the development of the embryo, fetus, weaner going forward through also with lactation, through the various different physiological processes of the cow, and then you have eventually the mature animal. You're actually storing a lot of carbon in the animal. And you can see it actually as you have a plantation of trees. So you plant a little tree, and then the tree grows, and as the tree grows and matures, during that growth period, it is absorbing carbon. Likewise, when the animal herd is growing, it is absorbing carbon, because you've said we are basically carbon-based milieu in which we operate. Biophysically, we are carbon-based milieu. Likewise, in the herbivores. So the carbon accounting does not take into consideration that the herd composition changes. It sees the herd composition as static, 100 head of cattle from here on to going forward. It's not the same cattle. Why is that so important? When you look at a static herd, then the carbon that is sort of encapsulated in that static herd is constant. And then you only have the methane emissions. And then you have to take that methane emissions into account and say, well, that methane emissions is additional greenhouse gases. When it is an additional animal that has now actually absorbed carbon, and then you've got a third calf and a fifth calf and an eighth calf, each one of those individual animals are carbon pools, absorbing carbon. Now suddenly you've got a plus and a minus, not just an emission. You also have a sink. So that's the first thing that we've tried to make explicit, is that carbon accounting is wrong by looking at it statically in one temporal space of 1 year. You have to look at dynamically across time, because that's why you've got cattle, is to make babies and to sell the babies. And when you sell the babies, are basically at a point in time when they have reached some degree of maturity. So the carbon accumulation in that carbon pool in the animal grows up to a maximum, let's say when the animal is 350 or 400 kilograms, thereafter it starts to level off, depending the specific breed that you've got. But mostly, the animals that's taken to slaughter is been slaughtered at that peak. So just as it starts to mature. So up to that point, it has absorbed a lot of carbon. The second problem within the carbon accounting system is that it does not take into consideration the interaction between the animal and the grasslands. And there, the manure is key and the dung beetles are key. Healthy soils with a vibrant population of dung beetles, the manure that is deposited is getting recycled and absorbed into the soil in a very quick period of time, actually days. Where if it is a soil that's deprived of nutrients, deprived of live organisms, deprived of dung beetles, the manure paddies will lie there in the sun, bake, and eventually oxidate. So the healthier an ecosystem, the faster the carbon that's captured in the manure is absorbed in the soil. So, and that carbon that's absorbed in the soil is then sunk for all the good things that we've discussed earlier. Whereas where it is a degraded landscape, and the soil, the manure paddy is lying there oxidating, then indeed that carbon that's captured in the mud paddy, in the manure paddy, does get emitted into the atmosphere. So now the challenge is not, okay, let's get rid of all the animals because there's emissions. The challenge is, let's restore the ecosystem, because that will solve the problem. Because if we've got the restored ecosystem, you will have much quicker absorption of the carbon that's embedded in the manure. So the carbon accounting does not take that effect into account. It assumes that the entire carbon content in the manure is being oxidated. Yeah. The fact that a large percentage thereof, even up to 80% of the carbon that's embedded in the manure gets absorbed through the dung beetles in the soil, is not acknowledged in that accounting framework. And the third big problem within the standard carbon accounting framework is then how the global warming potential of methane. Now, it used to be 21, a factor of 21, so 1 ton of methane is equal to 21 tons of carbon dioxide. It was then later updated to 28, and there are even attempts to make it towards a 32 or a 33 factor. But recent research by the team led by professors from the University of Oxford has realized that carbon is what is called a short-lived pollutant. Methane. Methane is a short-lived pollutant. What that means is that after 8 years, it's no longer CH4. It has broken up into a water molecule and an oxygen and a carbon molecule. And by breaking up, it does no longer have that global warming effect as if it has been a CH4 molecule. And by being short-lived, 8 years, it does not have the same effect as a carbon molecule that lasts for like thousands of years, or a nitrous oxide molecule, thousands of years. So a nitrous oxide molecule that lives for thousands of years is driven by the fertilization industry, as we know, and especially synthetic fertilizers. So if you think about it then, you take synthetic fertilizers with nitrous oxide as its pollutant that lasts for thousands of years. That goes onto a plant-based operation and then emitted, has got a much bigger, much stronger footprint than methane that's got an 8-year lifespan and then dissipates, breaks up. So the carbon accounting does not take that into consideration yet. I have to just give some credit, acknowledge the fact that this research is about 3 years old, and changes in the carbon accounting methods takes a long period of time, much longer than 3 years. So this research, this new knowledge about the longevity or the lack thereof of methane is pretty short. So hopefully the powers will eventually acknowledge this fact that the global warming potential of methane, rather than 21, 28, or 20 or 33, is much closer to a factor 7 or a factor 8. If you take these 3 things that I've mentioned now as a package, that the herd is not static, it's dynamic, with each calf, with each weaner going up to a level of being slaughtered, being a carbon pool, a tree, like a tree growing. And let's remember that the tree is also constantly in flux, emitting carbon and absorbing carbon, emitting carbon, absorbing carbon. It's just that during the growth phase, the absorption of carbon is more than in the mature phase. Likewise with a cow or with cattle. During the growth phase, the absorption is more than what is being emitted. The non-staticness or the dynamic nature, the interaction between the soil and the manure, and the global warming potential of methane. Taking those 3 things into account, we have realized that, cattle can be carbon negative, which came as a shock to many people, but it's increasing been realized that you have to take you have to do your accounting this way, and that cattle can be, when managed properly, I have to make that disclaimer, if it is managed in a way that degrades the environment or in a way that leads to more emissions through synthetic fertilizers, then no. But if it is managed in a way that, as I've just described, then they can be carbon negative, which then pulls the rug under any and all possible taxation questions, because they're actually beneficial to the environment when managed in this way.
James, Hendrik, thank you very much. I really enjoyed the discussion, learned a lot. Thank you for your time and for everything and your efforts. Carry on, and kudos to you for doing it.
Thank you, Gerry.
Thank you, Gerry.